welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Dave Champion, Ph.D., is a former Army Ranger, businessman, journalist, and law enforcement expert. In addition to being a physiologist with a doctoral degree in political philosophy, Champion has an extensive background in legal studies. Dave's first book is the groundbreaking and critically acclaimed Income Tax: Shattering the Myths. Today, we will be deep diving into his latest book, based on years of intense research, called Body Science. The book is an absolute clinic on the core principles of human physiology, leading to a clear understanding of how we can all get healthy, stay healthy, and reduce our odds of suffering from chronic disease to virtually zero. You can find his excellent book, Body Science, on his website at Dr. Reality, that's drreality.news. Dave Champion, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Casey, thank you very much. What a great introduction. I hear that. I'm like, so I did all that stuff? Really?
Damn, so cool. That's great. Yeah, we always joke that like we need to like read each other's introductions whenever we like walk into the room or something. We just feel so cool.
All right.
So it was, it was about a month and a half ago. I get an email for somebody I've never heard of before, and he very kindly says, "Hey, can I send you something?" And I'm like, "Okay, as long as it's not like a pipe bomb or something, like I guess that's fine." So I send this person my address, and I get this book called Body Science, and I start to flip through it, and I'm reading it. And I'm like, "Okay, this is pretty good." And I get a little further. I'm like, "Wow, this is really good." And by halfway through this book, I'm reaching out to contact you, who was that person, to say, "Dude, we got to get you on to talk about this. You wrote an incredible book, Body Science, and I would love to talk to you a little bit about the premise today." But first, I want to understand, how did you uncover this crazy story, which we're going to get into?
Okay, so it goes back several years ago, and I had insulin resistance and was unaware of it. The really interesting thing is I had been to about 3 doctors in the preceding 18 months and had presented each of them with the 5 primary symptoms of insulin resistance, though I didn't understand that at the time. And not one of those doctors, even though insulin resistance is rampant in the United States, not one of those doctors said, "Hey man, you've got insulin resistance." What they did was say, "We don't know what's wrong with you." So now I'm gaining weight because I've got insulin resistance. I'm gaining weight. I can't get it off at the gym. I can't change it by diet. And I knew nothing about ketosis at that time. And I walk in the gym and I see this guy. I hadn't seen him in about 8 months. He's across the gym. And I look over and I go, "Holy cow, is that Sean?" Nah, that can't be Sean, because that guy's like half the size that Sean used to be.
Wow.
And all of a sudden the guy turns around. I'm like, "Holy shit, it's Sean." So I walk over and I'm like, "Dude, you look great. What's going on?" And he tells me about this kooky diet called keto. And, I hear him out. He's talking about 80% fat in his diet and everything. And on the one hand, my brain is going, "You know what? This is just nonsense." But I'm looking at this guy who's half the size he used to be. He was visually obese, not just by body mass index. He was visually obese. And now the guy is looking pretty good, right? So I'm like, okay, so my mind is telling me this is BS, but I saw it with my own eyes. So I got home and I told Jen about it. I said, "You know what? I'm going to sit down and I'm going to start doing some research tonight." And I did. And I spent 3 weeks. I found out what keto was. I spent 3 weeks researching the physiology behind it. And I told Jen, I said, "You know what? My main concern is that this is not physically harmful, right? If it's not the greatest thing since sliced bread, that's fine. As long as it's not physically harmful, let's give it a shot." She said, "Yeah, let's do this." And we did. And that was the beginning of my journey. And of course, since then, I've traveled 1,000 miles as far as understanding the physiology of glucosis versus ketosis.
So where did you first come across that term? I want to go into some of the terms you use in the book, and that's a really interesting place to start. Glucosis. As soon as I saw it in the book, I'm like, wait a second, I've never come across this term. I have no idea what this means. You define it quite simply, and it makes a lot of sense.
One of the when I sat down to write Body Science, one of the problems I saw with how we'll just call it the medical establishment has done business over the last, say, 150 years is we all know when the 100 trillion cells of your body use primarily fatty acids and to a lesser extent ketone bodies as their energy source. Once you've been in ketosis for some period of time, your body has your cells have virtually no use for glucose. So there's this other hemisphere. Ketosis is one hemisphere in which your body can operate, and there's the other hemisphere. And of course, we know there's only two hemispheres. So the alternate hemisphere, the one that 99+% of the world lives in, is where their 100 trillion cells use glucose for energy, and they're being forced to use glucose for energy, which is one of the big problems with the public understanding, because anything they read by the medical establishment or by the nutritional research establishment says glucose is the natural, right, and proper fuel source for your 100 trillion cells. Right. And that's utter and complete bunk. But the problem I found as I started to write the book was, wait a second. Back in the 1920s, the term ketosis was coined. So what is the name for the other hemisphere? I mean, we have the northern and southern hemisphere as far as the globe is concerned, right? Imagine if you had the northern hemisphere and nothing. How would you refer to the other half? Right. And that's exactly the dynamic that the medical community had created 150 years with what I had to finally come up with a name, glucosis, because we're burning glucose, right, in that mode. It was ketosis and then this other thing. And so it was so it's ketosis and the method that shall not be named. What? This is nuts. How do you communicate? How do you talk if you don't have words that describe a physiological condition? So I came up with one.
Wow. I like it. I really love it. It's really interesting and puts it into perspective. On the one hand, you're burning fat and ketones. You are in ketosis. On the other hand, you're burning glucose. You are in glucosis. I think that's very clear and interesting that you had to go and name something that was just not even named. That's so crazy. Can you define for us the difference between cholesterol, lipids, and what a lipoprotein is? Because this is another big star of the show.
Okay, so lipoproteins is a gigantic category of elements within the human body that do all sorts of wonderful things. LDL is just one particular flavor or version of lipoproteins. Typically, of course, we all hear that LDL is the bad cholesterol and HDL is the good cholesterol.
Right.
And I want to be very clear that those descriptors are bunk and absolute utter nonsense. There is nothing bad about LDL cholesterol, and there is nothing inherently good about HDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol has a proper physiological function, and HDL has a proper physiological function. When we drill down, we get into other subsets of those lipoproteins, which are things like Lp(a), which is a pretty hot topic right now in the ketosis world. You've talked to Dave Feldman and you've talked to Siobhan, so you're familiar with their work, and they do a lot of stuff with Lp(a). I think the most important thing for people to take away from hearing you and I talk today is, aside from the macro picture of ketosis versus glucoses, the most important thing is we need to get over this societal false narrative that LDL is bad and HDL is good. The reason is this an appropriate point to get into why it is thought that LDL cholesterol is bad?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So we have to go back all the way to the 1950s and Ansel Keys and his bogus research that was paid for by the sugar industry, in which he came out and, instead of attributing the rampant increase in heart disease across the United States to what it really came from, which was carb intake generically and sugar intake specifically, or I should say not specifically, but to a lesser extent. So we had this whole carb dynamic that the world had never known before, and that was fueling the heart disease epidemic, or what was viewed as an epidemic back in the 1950s. And so he took sugar money, and then he said, okay, so I took their money, it can't be sugar, so I have to find something else. And his research was totally bogus. One of the most outrageous stories came from one of his research assistants when he was doing research across Europe. And he would give people in these communities written questionnaires, and he would ask them to fill them out. And if the results that he got back on the questionnaires from the community did not confirm his hypothesis that he wanted to confirm because the sugar industry was paying him, he simply threw them in the trash and told his research assistants they obviously lied. No evidence that they lied, but since it was antithetical to what he wanted to say in the end, he threw them in the trash. So literally threw them in the trash. So he ended up with confirmation bias. If you want this hypothesis to be true and you throw away all the evidence that it's false, then the only evidence left is that it's true. So he did this 7 countries report, which I talk about in Body Science. And that was spread far and wide across the United States. And suddenly, and Ansel Keys had a powerful personality, and he was a huge intellect. He was corrupt as hell, but powerful personality, well-liked, well-received, came off very professional. And so he started to gain traction. Now, interestingly, he went to the American Heart Association and he said, I want you to adopt the conclusions from the 7 nations report. And the American Heart Association looked at it. They were like, nah, not really. Can't go there. We don't see this as credible. So Keys, being part politician, not holding public office, but he was he knew how to wrangle things politically. He actually got a seat on the board of the American Heart Association, then slowly brought his Confederates in. And when they had enough votes, they then had the American Heart Association vote to adopt his principles, right? Wow. Which were completely bogus. And starting in 1980, the United States government then adopted them. And of course, whenever the government speaks, everybody says, well, that must be gospel. Right. So once the United States government adopted what had originated as Keys's bogus conclusions, it was all over but the shouting. Americans started dropping red meat. They started dropping saturated fat intake. They started increasing all sorts of other things. But I think more importantly, the big damage here is the emphasis was taken completely away from carbs generally and more pointedly sugar, which is exactly what Keys was paid to do and did. I have to give him credit. He did a fantastic job of misleading an entire country and, in fact, to a lesser extent, the world.
Wow. Yeah, it's so crazy. I mean, if this would have happened in any other industry, if somebody would have been developing brakes for a truck or something and the brakes were shown to be faulty in their testing and an employee just threw some of the records away, like there would be a riot on the street. Like there's like, it seems no other industry that this could be allowed to happen. It's so bananas. It's almost unbelievable. It's crazy.
Yes. And Of course, as you know from having read Body Science, in chapter 13, I talk about the economic consequences. And it is those economic consequences which involve trillion-dollar industries, which is why, despite you and I knowing all of this information and you and I living it out, most Americans, I'm going to guess more than 95% of Americans don't know anything that we're talking about today.
That's right.
The reason is the establishment, which to a great extent is the government and to a lesser extent, a number of universities and research institutions. The establishment has a complete funding blackout on ketosis. And that complete funding blackout confirms they already know what the results would be, because we spend literally trillions of dollars on medical and nutritional research, except on this one area where there is zero research. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so crazy. Wow. Yeah. That chapter with the financial implications, like I knew that, obviously finances are involved. And if everybody starts eating this way, nobody makes a lot of money on people, but to actually see the totals that you have in that chapter were absolutely staggering. It's so crazy. So, okay, so we have glucosis, we have ketosis, we've got cholesterol, which everybody knows, comes from food and is bad. Generally speaking, if you have too much of it, we've got LDL and HDL, which are lipoproteins, like you mentioned, and tell me if this is a good way to think about it. The cholesterol, when we talk about cholesterol, there's no such thing as good or bad. It's just cholesterol. What we're talking about when we say, LDL is bad, HDL is good, which isn't true, like you said, is it's more like the fats and lipids and cholesterols can't really move through the blood very easily because they're hydrophobic. They don't swim. So they need some type of transportation system to carry that essential nutrient, which is cholesterol, out to the body or bring it back to the liver. Is that an okay way to say it? It's almost like passengers inside a car.
Very much so. I think, though, it's important to clarify or add additional framework that the cells themselves, almost every cell in the body, there are a few exceptions, but almost every cell in the body produces its own cholesterol.
Yep.
Right. So what you and I are talking about now, when we're talking about the delivery vehicle, we're talking about the conversion that takes place in the liver when the body has to go into the emergency oh shit mode and get rid of all the high blood glucose. The liver then converts the glucose into triglycerides. Again, as you said, triglyceride is a fatty acid and it's hydrophobic and it can't play well with water at all. So it's packaged inside this container, as you said, the LDL, and then the liver starts spitting them out by the literally the trillions into the blood. So that's where blood-borne cholesterol we find it. That is not, which is not the same as the cholesterol that's self-produced by virtually every cell in the body. The cholesterol self-produced in the cells there would never ever be a question if that was harmful.
Right. And it's
the stuff circulating in the blood where we go, okay, what's going on here?
Yeah, it's counterintuitive because you would think if I eat cholesterol is going to get inside me, it's going to get right into the bloodstream, and that's going to clog my arteries. And I think that's the really simplistic way of thinking about this. What you are explaining sounds like the hepatic lipid system, which you talk about in the book. Can you elaborate a little bit on what that is and what that means?
Sure. Hepatic is a medical indicator for liver function. And one of the things I found, this is somewhat like having to name glucoses because the medical community had not. One of the things that I found is the system that I started to talk about where the body goes into the emergency mode and has to clear high blood glucose out of the blood because that's high blood glucose is very damaging to the tissues of the body. So when it does that, it has a couple of mechanisms to do that, but the primary one and the one that the medical industry mischaracterizes as far as that it's bad for you. And it is if you're living glucoses. Let me be clear. So the blood goes through the liver strips the glucose out, the liver converts it to triglycerides, packages it in LDL and sends it out. That's the short version. Then LDLs, they end up as IDL and VLDL, which those two fall into the category of remnant cholesterol, which we can talk about on another occasion, which is actually the gold standard. Remnant cholesterol is the gold standard for whether or not you're in glucosis and have a health problem. So anyway, so we've got this hepatic system that strips the glucose out of the blood and puts this LDL into the blood. Now, you had Dave Feldman on. I don't know if you guys talked about triglycerides, but Dave Feldman has an awesome character. His background is actually as an engineer.
That's right.
So he has a great perspective on triglycerides as packaged in LDL through the hepatic lipid system, which we're discussing. And he says quite correctly, when he phrased it this way, it was like, wow, I love this. He said, from an engineering perspective, there's absolutely no reason that energy should be stored in the blood. Okay. And that's exactly what happens with the hepatic lipid system, with the glucose being converted into triglycerides stashed inside LDL particles and then spit out of the liver into the bloodstream. That is exactly what's happening. It is being stored in the blood until it then can be stored in the adipose tissue, which is commonly known as body fat. And not the visceral kind on the inside, the kind you can see on the outside. In this whole system that we're describing, where you've got this the highly elevated glucose. It goes into the liver strips it out, converts it to triglycerides, packages it in LDLs, spits all the LDLs out. The LDLs eventually have to get rid of the triglycerides. They do that with by putting it in the adipose cells and so forth. This whole process that you and I just are kicking around did not have a name. It's a very quantifiable series of events that begin with X and end with Z, right? And yet the medical community had never given it a name. And again, I question, as you know from reading the book, is there some improper reason that these things have never been named? Because how do you talk about them if you can't name them?
That's right.
So I had to come up with a name where we go from the beginning point to the ending point of this process. And the name I came up with, because it relies on the liver, it is a liver-driven operation, is the hepatic lipid system. It takes glucose and turns it into lipids that should not be in your body.
And this is the emergency backup that should run very occasionally, not to be throttled all the time, correct?
Absolutely. If we go back, say, we'll just go back 20,000 years ago to ancient man, before the first agricultural revolution and so forth. Man ate overwhelmingly animal flesh, and the occasions when he could have gotten enough carb-heavy foods where his glucose would rise anything more than a trivial amount was almost unheard of. It was almost never. In an entire lifetime, it was almost never. However, if he did come across something and he was able, ancient man, was able to drive his glucose level up to some, what today would be minor levels, but in his world would have been an extraordinarily high level, the hepatic lipid system would have been part of the equation that the body used to bring his numbers back into balance again.
Gotcha. So let's contrast that. So we talked about the hepatic lipid system. In that state, let's go back 20,000 years, in the state that we assume that man was probably in ketosis all of the time. Can you tell us a little bit about the lymphatic lipid system and the difference between those two?
Okay, let me start with, yes, I had to name this one too.
Glad you did.
Because once again, this entire process from the minute that any fatty acids, which would be dietary fat, any fatty acids that hit your intestines, and what happens from that moment all the way to the point where a cell oxidizes that fatty acid as energy, that whole process from A to Z didn't, again, have a name. So now it does, the lymphatic lipid system. And the reason that I named it the lymphatic system is the initial path from the fatty acids that are emulsified in the intestines that then end up being incorporated into something called a chylomicron, which then only in that form can it transit the intestinal wall. Once it transits the intestinal wall, unlike other substances that go directly into the blood, the chylomicrons go into the lymphatic system. And most people, they've heard of like a lymph node, but beyond that, they really they're not aware of the word lymph, like what it means, what it is. They may have heard that they have something called a lymphatic system. So this is how crucial it is. It takes fatty acids and it brings them up through the portal and then drops them out just above the heart into the aorta. So that's where now these fatty acids, much like the triglycerides produced by the liver in the hepatic lipid system, have to ride inside the LDL container. Likewise, the fatty acids that come out of the lymphatic portal, they also are hydrophobic. They also have to ride inside a container, and that container is the chylomicron. So they travel throughout the body. Now, this is unlike the hepatic lipid system, which produces incredibly unhealthy results for the average human being, well, for all human beings. The lymphatic lipid system is exactly how our bodies are intended to operate. So the chylomicron, it flows through the blood, and then there's a ApoB100, which is, I'm not going to get into all that. That's the sciencey part. We'd be here all day. It basically, if you consider the chylomicron as a delivery truck, and when it leaves the factory, the back door is locked. And so what happens is the HDL that's floating around in the blood links up with the chylomicron, and it transmits, it loans an enzyme, and the enzyme unlocks the cargo door of the chylomicron. Okay, so I mean, the body is just an amazing thing, and then
Incredible.
it gives that enzyme, gives that enzyme back to the HDL lipid. So then it goes along, and the chylomicron links up with each cell that needs energy, and it transfers the fatty acids into the cell, and the cells use the fatty acids, they oxidize it for energy. Now, I think the really important point to make is this. I said earlier that the long-standing false establishment narrative is that glucose is the way that the body is to create, that the cells are to create energy. It is the proper, right, and normal way, and everything else is some sort of fluke that is completely 180 degrees opposed to reality. The cells oxidizing glucose is part of that emergency system to reduce the amount of blood glucose, to bring down the blood glucose level. Okay? It's part of that system. The liver cannot handle it all, so insulin signals the cells to open up and take in the glucose to get it out of the blood. And of course, the research narrative is, well, yeah, we want the glucose in the cells. No, it's an emergency mechanism. There is no benefit to running in the emergency mode 24/7 your entire life. It actually breaks down the body's systems. Conversely, the lymphatic lipid system, it delivers only fatty acids. So here's the deal. We've got the one hemisphere, glucosis, where the cells burn glucose. We've got the other hemisphere, ketosis, burning primarily fatty acids and to a lesser extent ketones. Burning glucose is like putting diesel in a Maserati engine. Okay? And burning fatty acids is like putting high octane fuel in your Maserati engine. And somehow the establishment has gotten this completely backwards. And they want to claim that pumping diesel into the gas tank of your Maserati, oh, hell yeah, that's totally normal. Let's do a whole bunch more of that. It's so apparent. You've read Body Science, so you get it. But it's so apparent that that's nonsense. It is literally mind-boggling that a gigantic percentage of the civilized world actually believes that nonsense.
Wow. That's so crazy. Okay, so let's just quickly recap. So in the lymphatic lipid system, this is the system that is designed to run efficiently pretty much all of the time. So if I am eating primarily animal flesh, I'm consuming proteins and fats, preferring the fats for energy. Those come into my body. They do not go directly into the bloodstream. They go through the lymphatic system, into a chylomicron, and they get distributed for energy, which is to be burned, not to be stored. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Not one single bit of the fatty acids that are delivered through the lymphatic lipid system are stored. None. Zero.
Okay. Then I am out in the world. Occasionally I will come across some fruit, maybe some honey, something that is carbohydrate based. That's going to be pretty rare because I'm competing with other animals, which I love that you made that point in the book. Birds probably are going to access those fruits way better than I'm going to be able to. Those foods are pretty much seasonal unless you live in very specific parts of the world. You're probably not going to see them all the time. And they're very different from the fruits and whatever, carbohydrate foods we think of today. They were vastly different back then. Is that, are we good so far?
Absolutely. Fruits and vegetables that we walk into the grocery store and look at today and readily identify, we would have no idea what the hell we were looking at 25,000 years ago.
Softball-sized apples, like you can buy in May. It's absurd, and most people never stop to consider it because that's their normal. That's what they've grown up with.
Yeah, there's been a lot of hybrid breeding that has made things much more desirable from a consumer perspective over the last 100 years or so.
Gotcha. Okay, so ancient man, again, he's living mostly in ketosis, eating lots of proteins and fats. Probably doesn't need to eat very frequently because he is running on those ketones, using them for fuel, not storing them. Occasionally, he has something maybe that's a little sweeter, carbohydrate based. He'll eat that. Hepatic lipid system kicks on, deals with this rare occasion, that doesn't happen very often, and sorts out the problem as an emergency mechanism. And we can go back to living primarily in ketosis, pretty healthy and happy, and continue down that path. And we've done that for tens and hundreds of thousands of years. Is that correct so far?
Yes, I do want to highlight one point where you talk about, okay, so he stumbles across some stuff that's sugary or high carb, and the hepatic lipid system kicks in to resolve that. And then he never does leave ketosis, by the way, when that happens, because it's such a momentary event that it doesn't change his physiology. His cells still only want fatty acids. It takes some period of days in order to flip back. Okay, but the important point I want to make here is that incident, he stumbles across, we'll use honey, because since you mentioned that, although that tends to be more of a fructose issue, but nevertheless, we'll use that as an example. And so his blood glucose goes up, the hepatic lipid system kicks in and resolves that. That did zero damage to his body. Now, the reason I bring that up is what the standard American diet does, and what vast majority of Americans, and probably people in the Western world generally do, is they require that emergency hepatic lipid system. They require that to run every single day, multiple times a day. It is the norm, this emergency system that man's genetic coding intended to have used once in a blue moon. They make it run constantly for their entire lives. And then the body gets worn down by that. And finally, by the time you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, on comes the chronic disease. And that really is a manifestation that the body simply cannot cope with the ongoing abuse any longer.
Wow. Okay. So you mentioned a few points in time that are very important to understand how we got to where we are today. And I'd like to get into that. We have talked to a few paleoarchaeologists like Dr. Bill Schindler, Dr. Mickey Bendor. They talk about how our brains are now smaller than they used to be. We used to be taller. We used to have really strong bones, wide teeth, essentially like very, very healthy as human beings living in that particular state. But there were a few really, really important events that happened. One about 12, maybe 15,000 years ago. Can you talk about what happened that started us down this path of running that emergency system all the time?
Yes, it is called the first agricultural revolution. And essentially, that we can simplify that and say humans learned how to cultivate, how to farm. And virtually anything that grows out of the ground, a plant, is carbohydrates. Okay? So about 12,000 years ago, the trajectory of what we ate began to change. As you can imagine, if I say it started 11,000 years ago, I'm sorry, 12,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago, the change was very minor. And with time and learning more how to cultivate, how to farm, the percentage of carbohydrates in the human diet gradually increased. Now, we get into about the 19th century, and this is where things change dramatically. That is the second agricultural revolution. And this was, I get that the British thought that they were doing a great thing when they learned how to exponentially increase crop yields. They didn't understand what they were really doing, what the consequence was. Nobody understood back then because we didn't have the science. And it had happened so gradually that the change in human physiology was unnoticed generation to generation. And then, of course, then we have the beginning of the 20th century and what I have dubbed the third revolution of bringing carbohydrates to the table. That is where science started taking things that were grown taking them into a laboratory, creating things never before known to humankind, and saying, look what we did. We processed this, and now it's even better than it ever was. And perhaps for the taste buds, that might be true, but physiologically, it took the damage to a stratospherically new level, which is why, if we go back before the 20th century, say to the late 1800s, heart attacks were virtually unknown. And doctors had to travel many, many, many states away, which was arduous back then, right? They had to travel just to take a class about this weird thing called diabetes, because most doctors had never met anyone with diabetes, no less had a patient who was diabetic. So they had to travel to go to these classes to completely, it wasn't even taught in medical school. They had to go to these classes because that was the only way to get the information. That tells you how incredibly rare, if there was no heart attack, almost no heart attacks, heart disease was incredibly rare, diabetes was virtually unknown. And so then we transit into the 20th century with this industrial produced food, where they take what grows out of the ground and then they process it. And all of a sudden, this eventually, by the time we get to the 1940s and 50s, we have this epidemic that Ansel Keys was supposed to address. So you see the timeline all the way from 12,000 years ago to Ansel Keys and his corrupt research, resulting in America adopting the completely wrong, inaccurate dynamic.
You mentioned processed foods. I'm thinking of three in particular that stand out as probably the most damaging. The first you mentioned, which is grains. When we increased our yields of grains, that was inherently a very bad thing. Second thing I would think of would be the refinement of table sugar. We learned how to get it from beets. Is that correct?
Sugar beets and sugar cane.
Okay.
For instance, Alexander Hamilton was born on a small Caribbean island where they had slaves producing sugarcane.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so those are the two. The third I'm thinking of right around, the beginning of the 20th century would be vegetable oils. Crisco in 1911, first hydrogenated fat that came from cottonseed. Would that be the third highest offender in your opinion?
Yes. Vegetable oil has been the scourge of modern, we'll say post-World War II, just to give it a finite time frame. It has been the scourge of public health, and not so much the obesity. That's more the other starchy, grainy processed foods. It has been the scourge of the public's health in terms of cancer. Science has known since the 1970s that a diet heavy in vegetable oil produces a 300% increased risk for colorectal cancer and a 200% increased risk of cancer, all cancers across the board. And yet, knowing that as early as the 1970s, in the 1980s, the United States government said, Ansel Keys says saturated fat will give you heart disease. So eat this, we all know this phrase, right? Healthy fats. Now, also, I think an important thing for people to realize is the term vegetable oil is one of the biggest scams in modern consumer history.
Thank you.
With the exception, perhaps, of things like avocado oil or olive oil, that's not vegetable oil at all. When you walk down the aisle at Walmart, I actually did a video about this one time where I filmed this, like, I don't know what it was, like 25 feet of a 7-high-foot rack filled with stuff saying vegetable oil on the label. Okay. And not a drop of it is from vegetables. It is oil industrially removed from nuts and seeds and grains. It has absolutely nothing to do with vegetables. Now, do you imagine if it was anything other than the multi-trillion-dollar processed food industry that the United States government would allow something that has nothing to do with vegetables to bear the name vegetable oil on the label. Okay, now, as you can imagine, since the oils from these nuts, seeds, and grains are pressed out of them industrially, you can imagine this did not exist prior to the 20th century, right? Humans ate whatever they got, which is very, very, very minimalistic, from nuts, seeds, and grains, would have been from the trivial amount of nuts, seeds, and grains they would occasionally consume, right? So all of a sudden, what happened was humans went from eating virtually no nut, seed, and grain oil, euphemistically known as vegetable oil, virtually none, to suddenly the government saying, yeah, just pour this crap right down your throat and you'll be healthy.
Wow.
As I discuss in Body Science, the body is genetically coded for animal flesh and the fat that comes from it. If our ancient ancestors, starting from, say, just to pick an arbitrary number, 10,000 years ago, all the way back to as far as bipedal humans, whatever they were eating, we'll call it 1 million years, whatever they were eating for 1 million years is what our bodies are genetically coded to run on properly and healthfully. So all of a sudden we get into the 20th century and boom, things that the human body never was intended to consume are consumed in massive quantities. Now, somebody might say, and what's your point, Dave? So what? Well, the point is we now have in the United States, in the Western world generally, the highest degree of chronic disease exponentially of any time in the entire history of the planet. It is estimated that about somewhere over 60% of the United States public has one or more chronic diseases. If we go back to pre-20th century, say into the mid-1800s, that number probably would have been about 1.5%. And those were people who had chronic disease based on a genetic issue, such as type 1 diabetes. So you go from virtually non-existent to rampant illness in 150 years. And what changed in that 150 years? What we stick in our mouths? It doesn't take a rocket science.
Yet we blame butter. We blame butter and red meat.
Right, and bacon.
It's absurd. It is absolutely absurd. And I'm so glad you talked about some of those implications of what happens when we run that hepatic lipid system all the time. And I would argue you probably learned all you needed to know about what those implications were walking into that Walmart. I mean, just go out in public and see what people are like. They're not healthy. It's so sad to see. And it's all based on these lies. Absolutely not based on any type of science. We're given these dietary guidelines and they have a massive effect.
Right. I'll share a story. I was at the grocery store yesterday, and I saw a gentleman who was about 5'7" and visually obese, not just by body mass. He was like a beach ball with legs, and he's standing in the grocery aisle, and I'm pushing my cart down the aisle. And I thought to myself, he obviously has a primary care physician. He's almost certainly has a cardiologist. He might have a specialist in diabetes. He might have a nephrologist, and he might have an endocrinologist. And his insurance company is just pouring money out on his medical, quote, needs. And I thought to myself, if this same fellow got in his car and every single day, as he was driving around, when he pulled into a parking lot, he would just bump into the side of somebody else's car and damage the car. How long would it be before his insurance company said, dude, this is a choice. You don't have to bump into cars every day, okay? So you can stop bumping into cars or we're canceling your policy. But when it comes to killing yourself, when the car you're bumping into is your own health, you're damaging your own health every day, the insurance companies just keep paying out the money.
Wow. So crazy.
It's just insane.
That is insane. So at some point, you have to put your money where your mouth is. You can't just learn all this stuff and come up with this great book and great concept without trying some of this stuff yourself. So I would love to hear what you did and what you've experienced since you've adapted your diet. What kind of health experiences, health issues are you experiencing on a day-to-day basis? What does your day-to-day look like? Tell us about your own health, and if you're doing this, if you're consuming a massive amount of things like meat and fat, what is going on inside of you right now?
Okay, so I started out doing the keto diet, and I did that for a bit more than 2 years. And doing keto, which it's 80% fat, 15% protein, and 5% carbs, that's the, if you want to do like strict keto, that's the ratio. And so I did that for quite some time, and I'd been in the gym for decades, and I had a lot of muscle on me. So 15% protein was not working for me. So I upped it a little bit, and that kind of reduced the loss of muscle mass. But I felt great. Insulin resistance was gone within days. How shocking is that, right? By the way, I discovered that the symptoms I had taken to those 3 doctors I mentioned earlier, the very day I started researching ketosis, that first day after I saw Sean at the gym, that was the day I discovered the symptoms that I had shared with those doctors were the primary 5 core symptoms of insulin resistance. So all of those went away within days, probably less than a week. How astounding is that?
Wow.
Now, I'm not saying the consequences went away in a week, but the actual manifestations went away within a week. So I dropped 58 pounds in 6 months. That was all that weight I mentioned earlier that I kept packing on, and it didn't matter. I couldn't diet it away. I couldn't exercise it away because of the insulin resistance. So I lost 58 pounds. Some of that was muscle mass because I was still in the learning mode. I didn't realize 15% protein was going to have that impact. So I go along. My health improved considerably. I felt great. I went from hating cardio to, doing 10-mile-an-hour hit sprints. I loved it. It was absolutely fabulous. So fast forward a bit, I start reading up on carnivore, and this experimenting using ourselves as the first best test subject is commonly referred to in the research world as N of 1. And I have become a huge advocate and proponent of N of 1. I am my own best testing vehicle. So after reading up on carnivore for a while, as I had with keto before I began that diet, I decided, okay, I'm going to pull the trigger on carnivore. We're going to see what happens. Now, again, I'm sort of a scientist, so I want to take this step by step, not just jump in the deep end of the pool. So I did a 24-hour carnivore. I ate nothing but meat. And the next day I was like, okay, so that didn't change anything. I don't feel any different. It didn't cause any noticeable distinctions in anything. Okay, so then I said, I'm going to do a 20-day experiment. So I went 20 days. And at the end of the 20 days, I thought, I don't necessarily have all the data I want. So I'm going to extend this for another 10 days. I'm going to make it 30 days. And here I am 18 months later.
Wow.
Yeah. No, I think one of the most important things that for me, sharing from my personal anecdotes about carnivore, is I was a huge gym rat. I have been since I was 24. And I'm about to be 62 here in a couple months. So, and I'd always been one of these guys. I loved being strong. It wasn't about size. It was about strength. And so I would push the heaviest weights I possibly could. And when I was younger, older guys would go like, dude, you need to slow the hell down. You're going to wear that shit out. Right. And I was like, look at these old guys telling me to slow down. What the hell? I should have listened to them, because by the time I was in my 50s, late 50s, mid 50s, I was diagnosed with level 4 osteoarthritis in both shoulders. In other words, I had pretty damn close to no cartilage left in my shoulders, which is excruciating. I am a side sleeper. At that point in my life, I was glucosis. I had just been diagnosed. I couldn't go 20 or 25 minutes sleeping on one side before the pain would wake me up. I'd roll over on the other side. 20, 25 minutes later, the pain there would wake me up. It was brutal. It caused a lot of complications in my life, not to mention the gym, which is a thing I love, right? So I switched to carnivore. And I decided I wanted to do hanging straight leg raises for abs, right? This goes back probably a year ago, and maybe a little more than that. And I tried to hang, and because of my arthritis, I could only hang for about 2 seconds. The pain was so intense, I had to drop off the bar. So here we are now, 18 months into carnivore. I can hang as long as I want. I do all the ab work I want. I sleep on my sides. I sleep all night long without any pain in my shoulders. Yeah, I would say that I haven't had an MRI, so I can't say what the condition is. I can't say whether I still have level 4 osteoarthritis. So I'm not saying it's quote unquote healed or cured, but I can say that the implications of it in my life have probably been reduced by about 97%.
Wow.
And that all happened once I went carnivore. Wow. Now, let me just make sort of a broad blanket statement without getting into all the physiology of it. Protein is what builds and heals. This is within the ketosis framework when your body's functioning correctly. Protein builds and heals. Fatty acid fuels that process. Okay? So it's really simple. If you're not eating a massive amount of protein in terms of what society considers a lot of protein, if you're not eating a massive amount of protein and you're not eating a hell of a lot of fat, the system breaks down. So when I shifted to a massive amount of protein and a massive amount of fat, as far as the societal viewpoint is concerned, suddenly everything started healing itself. It's just amazing. But we're told don't do that. We're told if you have 300 grams of protein a day, that means you're eating way too much red meat and you're going to die of a heart attack. You're going to get cancer. The whole link, the bogus link between red meat and cancer. It's all scare tactics for which there's a whole bunch of agenda behind that I don't think we have time for today. But it's all scare tactics to get you to stop eating red meat. And of course, we know what the societal narrative is on high fat intake, saturated fat in particular. By the way, you are familiar, of course, that sperm counts and testosterone counts are diminishing all across the Western world.
That's right.
And the single most important dietary element that supports your body's your production of testosterone is saturated fat.
Yep. What
the experts have been telling us for 60 years, don't eat that, you'll die. Well, yes, something is going to die, and it's going to be your testosterone production.
That's right. I mean, that's why the Seventh-day Adventists got involved with like making cereal so they could feed people grains in the morning. So the kids wouldn't eat things that would make them, really viable and have lots of testosterone and high sperm counts. It's nuts.
Wow. Just crazy.
So crazy. Well, this has been an amazing journey, and I know you have been fortunate to continue in research. In fact, you're working with Dave Feldman and Siobhan on a new project. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. This is perhaps one of the most exciting things since I discovered ketosis for me. We've talked about the funding blackout for any research concerning ketosis. And I think one of the most illuminating pieces of research would be to take a group of people who are living in glucosis, get them into ketosis, take a blood test before they make the shift, and take a blood test 4 months after they make the shift, and presume if you can keep the participants participating incrementally further on, say a year, 2 years, and so forth. So that research, ironically, with the trillions of dollars that are spent on scientific research, that piece of research has never been done. Even though it's an incredibly low-cost study, it's never been done because of the blackout. So I got tired of waiting, so I'm doing it right now. I have set up the protocols for the glucosis to ketosis transition clinical trials. And right now I've got just shy of 50 people who are enrolled as participants. They all are living in glucosis. They've all committed to getting a blood test. Before they shift into ketosis, they're going to stay in ketosis 4 months, and then they're going to take a second blood test I'm going to get all those blood test results, and we're going to take a look and see what happened to their health. And it's not just blood test results. We're also going to get direct feedback from them about how they feel, about things that may have been plaguing them, and whether those things still do or do not. We're going to get body fat numbers and so forth. So this is should be a tremendous eye opener. And we can use this, we can carry this around like a carpenter does a saw and a hammer. So when somebody says, this is all nonsense, that the keto is a fad diet, ketosis is nonsense, the body's meant to consume glucose, we can pull this out. Okay. Now, if any of your audience would like to participate in this, we're just a week away from having the first automated page go up on the website. But if people want to let me know right now that they want to participate in this, they think this would be cool, they can simply email me at dave@drreality.news. Dr. Reality is drreality altogether, .news. Dave@drreality.news. Just put in the subject line something like clinical study. It doesn't have to be just that. I'll figure it out. But here's what I need in the body of the message. I need your name, first and last. I need a phone number where I can reach you, though I will likely never call you. It's just in case we have to talk about something critical. And lastly, I need your preferred email address to receive updates and study results and conclusions and things like that. So if anybody wants to participate, that's all they have to do.
Wow, that's amazing. That will be so cool to see the results of that. I think most of us in this world already probably kind of know how that's going to go, but you're right. That's a really important tool. That said, somebody doesn't need to wait for those results to come out before they can try this. And listening to you and your experience, I mean, you're almost 62, you're healthy as hell, you're so excited and positive, and you sent me this book for free, and it's amazing. Like, why wouldn't people just want to start living that life? And I would just want to know from you, what is one simple tip you would like a listener to take from this conversation, whether they've spent their life a little bit in glucosis or a lot of it? What would you want somebody to take away from this conversation?
This is going to sound self-serving, and I don't mean it this way. The single most important thing that anybody can do, if they have not yet done so, is read Body Science. The reason is, it's not about me selling a book. The reason is, and I think you will be able to validate this.
Yes.
Once a person reads Body Science, the establishment can never, ever fool them on issues of physiology and nutrition ever again.
Wow, that's so well said. I mean, I'm just reading a review on the back of the book. Dave Champion's ability to describe complex physiological principles in an easily understandable manner is impressive. That's crucial because everyone needs to read this book. And you know what, man? I couldn't agree more. You did a really great job with the book. I loved your concepts. I love that you were able to take us along that journey today and help us learn more. And for the listener, I really hope that you got a little bit of a taste to continue down this path, continue learning this stuff, because it is very important. It's important for you and your families and the people that are going to end up taking care of you and your children and what their following generations are going to look like. This is really, really important.
Should we mention one more thing before we go?
Sure, let's do it.
Because we talk about proof, right?
Correct.
Do you want to talk about the CAC scan?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. Coronary calcium scoring, oftentimes referred to as CAC scan. This is where you get in a device. It looks a bit like a resonance imaging device, but it's not. It's a different technology, very low radiation. And they scan your heart. They're looking primarily at the 4 primary arteries of the heart. And the level of calcium that might be adhering to the walls of the arteries, I'm not going to get into why it would adhere, is a pretty sound predictor of whether somebody has heart disease, how soon they may have heart disease, or how soon they may have a heart attack. Obviously, you want it to be 0. Doctors start to be concerned about at the 300 or 400 range. The facility at which I had my scan done said they've scanned somebody who came in as high as 6,500, which is insane. So I had my scan about 3 weeks ago, and my number at 62, eating nothing but red meat. And the National Institutes of Health and CDC would tell you I should be dead or at least terribly ill, right? I got heart disease.
Of course.
My score was 0. So I just wanted to share that with the audience because that's like proof positive. We can talk about theory, but yeah, then we find the very thing that indicates atherosclerosis, which a cardiologist would say, oh, Dave, you must have atherosclerosis the way you live your life. Yeah, it's zero.
That's incredible. Yeah, you made a great video about that, and I'm definitely going to link that to the show notes. The listeners should definitely go check this out. I'll quote the same quote I quoted you yesterday over the phone. Tom Clancy, the difference between fiction and nonfiction is that fiction has to make sense.
Casey, I have to tell you, thank you for reining me in a bit because, I can go nuts on this and you have kept this interview on beam and I really appreciate that.
And well, it's such a pleasure to have you on. You've done a great job explaining everything. This is such a complex topic. It was always going to be challenging to fit it into an hour. So we're just really grateful for you and for coming on the show. Can you tell the listener one more time where you want to send them so they can find you and find your work?
Okay, they can go to Dr. Reality, Dr. Reality .news, drreality.news. They can read up a bit on me. They can see the various books I've written. And again, if they want to participate in the clinical study, they can simply email me at dave@drreality.news.
That's awesome. Man, Dave Champion, Ph.D., thank you so much for everything you've done. Thank you for writing the book, Body Science. I really, really love it, and I hope people find that message and learn from you and continue to do more research if they want to, but you have put together a very understandable, easy to digest, pun intended, a book that explains these systems that, you're right, weren't even named before, and it makes it really easy to think about them and can help people decide how they want to live their lives. So thank you so very much. We're so grateful for you and for your work and for your time coming on the show today.
Thank you, my friend.
I'll be in Vegas sometime. You can take me to a Vegas Knights game. That would be great.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio. Dude,